Well, the first recipe we're going to do from the wartime is called Lord Woolton pie. Now, Lord Woolton was the Minister for Food. He was the one who successfully got Britain to accept food rationing. And in 1940, after he became the Minister, the head chef at the Savoy Hotel invented the Lord Woolton pie, especially for him. And it's actually, basically, it's a vegetable pie. And the point about it is that it uses up homegrown vegetables. And what we've got in it, and there's a variety of ways of making it, but we're using a pound of cauliflower, a pound of Swedes, a pound of carrots, and a pound of potatoes. Now what we're doing is we're also going to add in an onion. Now during the war, onions were worth their weight in gold. Before 1939, Britain imported most of their onions from the continent, and obviously once war started it became impossible to import onions, so we were left as a country to trying to grow them ourselves. And that's again where allotments became really useful, because that's where most of Britain's onions were grown. And if you didn't have an allotment, the chances of being able to get an onion was quite difficult, or you paid a lot of money for it. In fact, there's records, some of the records show that onions were actually used as wedding presents, so they're obviously worth quite a bit. So we're going to use one of our onions from the allotment to make a Lord Woolton pie. The next ingredient is a tablespoonful of oatmeal, and then 1 teaspoonful of vegetable powder, and then add in some water. Now this water we used for boiling yesterday's potatoes, which we used for lunch today. So you don't want to put too much water in, perhaps we need a little bit more than that, but then we just boil these for about 15 minutes so that the vegetables are soft. But once the vegetables have softened through, you then need to add them to the pie dish. The final thing to add is some herbs, just to give it that little bit of extra taste. Now the recipes I've seen for the peerage show that people were tending to use parsley in this recipe. I'm going to put in instead some chives, some thyme and some rosemary, and we'll just sprinkle them in to the top of the dish. And finally we've got to add the topping, which is made from wholemeal pastry. Now wholemeal flour is very important in the Second World War. White flour was virtually unavailable, and at some point the government did actually ban the production of white flour. But we had a slight problem when I made this, because we actually ended up using 3 ounces of our cooking fats, and overall one person was only allowed, typically during the war, 4 ounces of cooking fat a week. So we're going to have to be very careful with the way that we use our cooking fat in future. This is the final product waiting to go into the oven. Looks a bit rough and ready, but here goes. Well, this is the moment of truth, my first wartime recipe, and here goes. It certainly smells good. And what we're going to do is put on a bit of gravy that we made from a bit of the juice that was left over, plus a bit of vegetable stock, vegetable powder. Right, here we go. Oh, actually, it's very hot. Oh, But actually this has come out rather well, so I think we have a wartime success. During the war years, the government did everything they could to reduce the amount of food that we were importing by increasing the amount of food that UK farms were producing. Now, one of the problems that they faced was that a lot of food could be wasted on the farms before it ever got to market because of pests and vermin. And wood pigeons were amongst those pests that ate their way through large parts of British crops, particularly grain crops. So farmers were encouraged to have these little critters shot, and one shoot could take out hundreds and hundreds of these birds. Now, you didn't want to waste these birds. This is game and it has meat on the breasts. And what we're going to do today is have a go at turning this into wartime pigeon sausages. We've got our pigeon breasts there, and we're going to add into it some sausage meat. Now, if you were a member of a pig club, or you kept a pig in your back garden, or you're on a farm where you could keep a couple of pigs, then that was great. You had a supply of pork meat. Otherwise you would have had to go to the butcher for sausage meat, and it would have been very limited in supply. Now, the other thing about the pork sausage meat is that that's going to give a bit of fat to these sausages as well. Now, the other ingredients we're going to use are some cooking apples. These apples came from another food swap that we did recently, and we've got onions. During the Second World War, onions were in short supply. They were worth their weight in gold, and a huge part of the onion crop was grown simply on allotments. And one final addition to this recipe is this. This is rowan jelly. Now, rowan jelly is really good with game, and I made this about 3 years ago, and it's been sitting in my fridge ever since, so it's now going to find a new home in the pigeon sausages. Minced up the pigeon breasts. I'd weighed them already, so we had 650 grams, and this will go into a large mixing bowl. "500 grams of sausage meat, that goes into the bowl as well. Now, the point about wartime sausages is that it was often the case that the meat content would vary considerably, and in many times people referred to wartime sausages as being toast because there was more breadcrumbs in them than meat. And indeed, when I was listing the ingredients earlier, I forgot to mention that breadcrumbs go into this as well. But we're going to add in 500 grams of sausage meat to our 650 grams of pigeon meat. Next up, we have 3 apples, cooking apples, and 2 onions. 200 grams of breadcrumbs. Now, in the modern world, unbelievably, people actually buy breadcrumbs from the supermarket. You don't need to do that. You just need to dry some bread out and then put it through your liquidizer, and it comes out as breadcrumbs. Why waste your money on buying it? So we're going to add this in, and I've got to say the amount of breadcrumbs would have varied throughout the war, and we're adding 200 into this. It may be that people during the war years would have used more, possibly at times with a good supply of pigeon breasts, that may have used less, but nevertheless we're going to add 200 grams into the mix. Then we're going to add in just a splattering of black pepper. This may or may not have been added in during the war, depending on how people were able to get their hands on that stuff. And finally, this was used extensively during the war, for all sorts of, to add flavour. Simply adding in 1.5 teaspoonfuls of salt, and then I'm just going to mix this all together. Well, it's partly mixed up now, so time for the final ingredient, which is the Rowan jelly. So we're just going to scoop the whole of this jar into the sausage meat mix. All now thoroughly mixed, and we're going to leave this to stand overnight so that the flavours can really blend in together. Well, the sausage meat has been standing overnight, and what we're going to do now is we're just going to sample a small bit like that. We're going to fry it and sample it to make sure we're happy with the flavour and texture. So here's the little bit of meat that's been frying for a few minutes. I've not sampled it yet, but here goes. Actually, that is much better than I expected. Yeah, alright, pleased with that. So we don't have to alter any of the ingredients now, we don't have to add anything more to it. So these are now ready to be, the meat's now ready to go into the sausage skins. What I would say though is that during the war period, the chances of you having sausage skins were probably quite remote. So you probably would have had sausages without sausage skins, but we're going to take advantage of being in the 21st century and put the sausage meat into skins. So, these are the sausages I've made. Not as good as the sausages I used to do years ago, because I'm a bit out of practice with sausage making. Anyway, we've left some of the sausage meat to be made into burgers. Now, the point about this is that pigeon is a pest, but in the wartime years they found a use for it, making it into, or using the breast meat to make into all sorts of things, and sausages was one of them, and it's much better than it being thrown out. So effectively, a waste product turned into useful meat and a useful food. Well, it's the first day of our wartime diet, and what we're going to have for lunch, our very first wartime lunch, is a plate of salad. Now, why a salad? Well, during the war, the Ministry of Food encouraged people to have salads, particularly during the summer period, for three main reasons. First of all, they were actually quite healthy, and if you look at all the propaganda that the Ministry of Food fed out to people, it was all about having a healthy, balanced diet. Britain needed a healthy population so that we could actually work in the war industries to produce the material that was needed to win the war. Now, the second reason why we're having a salad is because, generally speaking, most of what went into it was locally produced. And this is where having the allotment in the Dig for Victory campaign was so important. It gave us things like lettuce leaves, tomatoes, and particularly onions, which were in very short supply. And the third reason why we're having a salad, and the reason why salads were encouraged during the war, is because they involve very little cooking. And if you look at what's on the plate here, most of it is actually the salad leaves, but there are some potatoes, and the potatoes were the only food that we've actually cooked on that plate. And by saving energy on cooking, that too could go to the war industries, again to help us produce the war materials. Now, the potatoes themselves were actually one of the key foods of the Second World War. We couldn't have got through the war without potatoes. We grew virtually all our own potatoes ourselves, so it was a good locally produced material, good locally produced food. We didn't have to import these. It saved on shipping space. Oh, it tastes good as well. Wartime Britain wasn't exactly known for its junk food, and they didn't really have large quantities of things like potato crisps, certainly not in the way that we eat them now. Nevertheless, we are still interested in trying out some of the more snack type foods that were tried during the war. So we're going to have a go at making World War II style potato chips or crisps from potato peelings. Now you need a baking tray with a tiny little bit of cooking oil on it, or cooking fat. Now remember, you're using your rations for this, so you need just the minimum amount to stop it from catching on. And this is lard that we're using. Again, we don't normally use lard, but because we're in a wartime situation, then that's what we're using. Then just scatter the peelings over the tray, and then sprinkle over it just a tiny little bit of curry powder to give it a nice taste. And then when that's done, it can go back into the oven. After about 10 minutes, give them a check and a quick stir to make sure that they're cooking through and they're not catching on too much. Well, when they're crisp right through, they should be ready. Take a look there. Look nice and crisp. Oh, wartime crisps, ready for eating. During the Second World War, preserves and jams were very severely restricted. You were entitled to 1 jar of jam about once every 2 months. Frankly, I would get through a jar of jam like that in around about a week to 10 days ordinarily. Obviously on a wartime diet we're not able to do that. Now, Britain before the war imported most of her fruit, and government policy during the war was to encourage people to get their vitamins not from fresh fruit but from vegetables, because most of that could be grown within the UK. It was much more difficult to grow all the fruit that we needed, because frankly, although we can grow apples and plums and pears and so on, we couldn't just set up orchards overnight to be able to supply the entire nation with the fresh fruit that they needed. Things such as bananas and lemons we just never saw during the war, and what few oranges were available tended to be used for children. But there were ways around the preserve and jam shortage, and what we're going to do today is show you how to make a mock orange marmalade, which has no orange in at all, but it's made from apples, and you're going to love this one. It's made from carrots as well. Now, the idea here is that you're able to use material that was completely homegrown, locally produced, nothing imported. So, if you want to make a wartime orange marmalade, this is what you have to do. Chop your apple and then put it into a jam pan with water. Well, once it's come up to the boil, leave it to simmer for a couple of hours. After a couple of hours of simmering away, it should have pulped down like this. So at this point, it's ready to be strained. This has been straining for 24 hours, so the liquid is now ready to be measured to go back into the jam pan. Then need to grate a couple of carrots. The grated carrot then needs to be added to the jam pan, and then put a bit of heat under the pan to bring it up to the boil. Now I need to measure out a couple of teaspoonfuls of orange flavouring and add them to the pan. Well, when the pan's come up to the boil, it's then time to add the sugar. Now normally when I make marmalades and jellies, I would use a kilo of sugar for every litre of liquid. There's a war on now, so we have to make sure our sugar supplies, our sugar ration goes that little bit further. So I'm going to reduce the amount of sugar going in to 700 grams for every litre of liquid. Right, after it's come back up to the boil, what you need to do is check for its setting point and put a dollop of it on a saucer and then leave it to cool for a bit. And if it develops a skin like this has, then you know it is ready to go into hot sterilised jars. And at this point I'm just going to, remarkably, the orange flavour has come through. Well, I'm just going to try a slice of bread with a bit of our mock marmalade on there. As you can see, it's been very thinly spread, because we still need to make sure that this jam lasts us quite a while. Actually, that's not bad. The orange flavour does come through, and the consistency is very good. There's a good gel to it as well. So that seems to have worked. So how to make mock marmalade works very well. Well, one of the problems I foresee over the coming 2 weeks of this wartime diet is that I'm going to run out of tea. Now, I'm an inveterate tea drinker. I seem to drink at least 1 mug of tea through the day an hour, and the 2 ounces or 50 grams of loose leaf tea that we're entitled to each week is just not going to get me through that 2-week period. So I'm looking for an alternative to having tea every hour or so. And what we're going to do is I'm going to make mint tea. And this is mint from the allotment, and again this is where the allotment and the garden was so important during the war years for producing foods and flavourings such as these. So to make the mint tea, just get a couple of sprigs of mint freshly picked from the garden, and then just pour in the boiling water and leave it to brew for a couple of minutes. After it's brewed for a couple of minutes, just take it out and put that into your compost bin. Now, you can drink it like that. When I've drunk mint tea recently, it's because I've been in places like Morocco or Syria or other similar countries that drink mint tea on a regular basis. And they tend to add in a little bit of sugar or honey. Now I'm not going to do that this time, because this is we're in wartime now and we just can't afford to use our sugar rations on our tea. So here goes. Oh yeah, you do get a actually really nice minty taste. Hardly surprising since it's mint tea. Yeah, I think I'm going to be able to survive without my hourly cuppa by using this instead. Oh, yum.